Hi, welcome back to the planet. Okay, today I want to talk to you about interviewing. It's really one of the most vital things that you're going to be doing to get information for your story. So, really critical. It can also be some of the most intimidating things to do. Even today, if I have a big interview coming up, I get a little bit anxious about it, right? And I've been doing this for more than a quarter century. So, totally understandable if you're nervous about it, particularly if you haven't done it before. I want to answer some of your questions and give you lots of tips that are going to help you have successful interviews. But one of the keys to having successful interviews is going out and doing them. So just be willing to jump in. But before you jump in, you need to do a few things. First, you need to read the Planet Handbook chapter, How to Interview. And then you also need to read the Microsoft Word doc that I put together for you called Tools of the Trade. That basically explains some of the basic equipment that you're going to need to have a successful interview. So you should really look at those two things even before you watch this video. So if you're watching this video and thinking, I haven't done it, you should hit pause or stop, go back and look at those things and come to this. So what I'm going to do here today is not going to be the comprehensive account of how to interview. That's really in the Planet Handbook. But I want to touch on a couple of things that commonly come up in my conversations with students. So, first of all, I want to turn to some questions that people often ask related to sort of their concerns about it. I'm just going to dip into my magic top hat. Everybody should have a magic top hat. In this top hat, I have questions that are frequently asked, and then we're going to try to answer it. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Question number one, what if I'm not prepared enough for the interview? Well, so it's a good idea to prepare for an interview, and typically when I prepare for an interview, I want to learn a little bit about the person that I'm going to be talking to, and that involves like the name, where they work, that kind of thing, and a little bit about their history, whether it's the kind of research that they've done, if they're as a scientist, or where they work, if their job has something to do with it. And then obviously I want to prepare questions that I'm interested in asking them, but the one thing that I often see students do is that they over-prepare as, frankly, a way of procrastinating because they're anxious about doing the interview. So don't let the need for preparation to get in the way of actually doing the interview. Okay, let's look for another question. What if they insist on seeing the story? Right. If you have not run across this on the How to Interview handbook, we'll cover it now. Don't show sources the story before it's published. That's just standard journalistic rule. You never want to do it. There's two reasons why. One is that once people see a story, they want to start changing it. They want to become the editor of it. It's just irresistible. And so even if people say, well, I just want to make sure you get the facts right, you don't want to give them the story. Sometimes I will tell people, here are the facts as I understand them. Is that correct? So that's a way to fact check, right? And so the other reason why you don't want to give somebody an entire story is that they might then start to send it to other people, and it has been effectively published at that point before you've done all your fact checking and making sure that the story is really right. Okay, so if people say that they want to just know that the facts are accurate, you can assure them that the Planet has a very rigorous fact-checking process. We listen to all of the recorded interviews to make sure that the quotes are accurate. And so we really do want to make sure that it's accurate. And if you can also ask them, is there any particular fact that you're concerned about being incorrect? Because then they might just spell that out, and that's helpful for you too. So on two additional things that will happen, people will talk about wanting to go off the record. All of your interviews need to stay on the record. And on the record basically means anything they say you can quote. When people want to go off the record, that's effectively saying that it is a secret between you and the person you're interviewing. And for starters, what good does that do you? Because you can't share it with anybody. And second of all, you can wind up with some very confusing interviews where people go off the record and then back on the record, and then it's not clear what's on the record and off the record. So just say, listen, my editors say everything has to be on the record because it makes it clear. So everything's on the record. Okay. What if I forget questions? It happens to everybody. You can always follow up by email or a phone call. I don't write down every question ahead of time because I would wind up with this really long script, and I think it makes for a really wooden conversation. I like to have a more natural conversation. But what I will do is I'll write down 5 or 6 key questions that I just know I have to answer, and I'll have that on a little pad of paper next to my computer while I'm taking notes. And then I'll just check every once in a while and make sure that I've asked all the questions. Okay, what if they won't talk? Some people you interview are more cooperative than others. There's no doubt about it. And later in this lecture, I'm going to go through some questions that you can use to kind of loosen people up and get them to talk more. But don't take it personally if they're not talking. Sometimes it's just people's style. And if people just absolutely refuse to be interviewed at all, you can't make them talk, right? So you should move on to other sources, or you should ask them if there are any concerns that they have that you might be able to address. So those are some strategies. All right. What if I have to ask hard questions? Sometimes you're concerned that questions are going to upset the person that you're that you might be interviewing. First of all, I would save those questions until later. You don't want to start out with that being your first question. But also, 2 things I would say. One is, it's your job, right? I mean, journalists have to ask hard questions. You don't want to just ask softball questions, right? And usually people don't take these kinds of questions personally because they realize that what you're doing is your job. In fact, sometimes I think people would be surprised if you didn't ask the hard question because often they know it's coming, right? So it can be hard to ask the tough pointed questions, but I think you just have to be willing to do it. Okay. Another question. What if they won't let me record? Yeah, right. So one of the rules at the Planet is that all of your interviews have to be recorded, and that's for 2 reasons. 1, for you to make sure that you get your quotes correct, and 2, for the editors to make sure that you got the quotes correct. So effectively, if you don't record it, it didn't happen, and it can't really go in the story. So what you should do is just explain to people, look, I want to be sure that this is accurate. That's why I'm doing it. And you could also say that it's just a rule at the Planet that the editors want it. And so, one trick that many reporters, myself included, learn to use is to blame the editors. If there's something sensitive that comes along and you have a source that maybe isn't quite happy with what you're saying, you can just say, well, it's the editors say I have to do it. You don't want to lie, but it's often the case. So in this case, the editors say you have to do it. All right. What if I don't understand? Right. You might be writing about something that's kind of technical. You might be talking to an expert in a field. Let's say, like with the coronavirus, you're writing about virology. So that is totally reasonable for you to come in with a lot of questions, and also to not necessarily understand what someone says the first time they say it. Sometimes you'll be talking to people who are really technically knowledgeable but aren't very good at communicating what they know. And so your job as a reporter is to act as a translator between experts and the general public. And if you don't understand what the experts are saying, you can't really translate. So it's totally reasonable to if someone says something you don't understand, to just say, you know what, I didn't understand that. Can you explain it again? Or if you're not sure, you can say something like, I think I understand what you mean. Do you mean this? And you say back to them what you think they meant. And then they can correct you right there if you've got it wrong. Don't be intimidated about talking to people who know more than you do. I do it all the time. I mean, literally last week, I talked to two Nobel Award winning economists, right? These people are no doubt quite a bit smarter than I am. And I was a little nervous going into it, talking to them, but you know what? They were super nice. And when they said things that I didn't understand, I would say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that. Can you explain that again? Right? So there's nothing wrong with talking to people who know more about a subject than you do. I mean, that's why you're seeking them out, right? So don't worry about that. All right. Those are all the questions I've got. Now, I just have a hat. Coming up next, some key questions that you can use to loosen lips. Okay, I'm back, minus the hat. All right, I want to finish up this lecture by talking about some questions that I find I use again and again in interview after interview that are really helpful for getting people to open up, getting people to answer hard questions, and just in general giving me more information and more quotes that I can use for my story. Okay, so here are the questions, the top 10 questions that you should think about using. Okay, here's the first question. How do you know that? People will often make statements during an interview, and you'll wonder to yourself, how do they know that? Well, that's the question you should ask them. It's useful for two reasons. First of all, it's a good way to check where people are getting their facts. It's useful if people know what they're talking about. It's also useful if you question whether people really do know what they're talking about, because it will tell you where they're getting their information. And if they can't tell you if they can't tell you where they are getting their information, well, it's a good reason to sort of be maybe a little suspect about what they're saying. And the other reason that it's useful is that they can point you towards other sources that might be useful for your reporting, either documents or people. Okay, so how do you know that? Next, tell me more. I know, sounds simple, right? Sometimes these simple questions are the best. Sometimes people will give you a very short answer and you really want them to elaborate, and all you have to do is say, tell me more. All right, third, I don't understand. We've already gone over that a little bit, but that is a helpful question to have. You can say, I don't understand. Can you explain that to me again? Or can you explain that to me a bit more? All right, here's another one. Who else should I talk to? That's a very helpful question. Often I will ask that at the end of an interview. And it will often point me towards people that often turn out to be a better source than the person that I just interviewed. So who else should I talk to? Okay. How do you respond? And when that question comes up often is if there's some kind of controversy and I need to ask somebody a difficult question, a question that where they might feel like I'm challenging them, right? Sometimes you have to do that. But oftentimes what I find helpful is that instead of me criticizing, for example, I will point to people on the other side of an argument and I'll let them make the criticism. So for example, if I'm interviewing a politician, I might say, you know, I talked to one of your critics and they told me that they think you're exaggerating about the importance of what you're doing. What would you say to them? How do you respond to them? And the nice thing about that is it depersonalizes it. So the person I'm interviewing starts talking to the other person, not to me. And they'll often open up more. And then they also don't think of me as the source of the challenge. So how do you respond? That's handy. Another one is, do you remember a time? You are trying in your story or in your interviewing to get people to give you rich details. And people often talk in sort of general abstractions, and you're trying to sort of ratchet them down into a more detailed account of what's happening. And often, if you ask me, or if you ask them, do you remember a time? it gets them to think more in terms of stories than in terms of sort of general details. And that can be really great for a reporter. Another way to do that, and this is the next question, is give me an example. If somebody's talking in generalities, you can say, can you give me an example of that? And often then people will get more detailed. Another helpful question is, are there any other questions I should be asking? Right? And I know that sounds odd, but sometimes there will be a question that you should have asked, but you didn't know about it. Okay, so there's another question. And then, okay, so I know that this is really generic, but you need to ask, how do I spell your name? Where do you live? What kind of work do you do? And how old are you? And I know people get self-conscious about asking how old someone is, but you know what? It doesn't always matter in the story, but sometimes it does. Sometimes if you're trying to talk about, sometimes someone's age sort of factors into the story. So it's always helpful to know that. Okay, so, and then number 10 is whatever question you're dying to ask, but you're worried to ask. So if you're dying to ask it, your readers are probably dying for you to ask it too. And so even if it's an uncomfortable question, you just really need to answer it, or you need to ask it. So that's 10 questions that I hope will help you have successful interviews. So good luck. Go out there and start talking to people. Thanks very much.